Well, hey everybody, this is Brady Helkenn with BH Tech Connection, and I'm here with Jeff Young with Point, an IT managed services provider, or MSP as we like to call them. And Jeff is here to talk a bit about the origin of Point, what hospitality has to do with MSPs, and what the future of our industry looks like. Jeff, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me, Brady. And I've decided to lean into the bedraggled quarantine COVID look for now. So
It's a nice, genuine, and authentic look.
uh, I wouldn't choose those adjectives, but or my wife wouldn't. But thank you.
No worries. Well, let's go ahead and dive into those questions. First off, let's start with the origin of Point. What can you tell me about that?
Sure. It started about 15 years ago now, with one person. It was one guy and one bag. It's like the way that I think a lot of MSPs start. It's just one engineering guy who's like, sure, I can fix that for you. And his name is Gene Rich. And he was in New York and just started, he has a computer science degree, and he was just like, I can do this. I can help people with their computers. So he started out, with a Mac in a backpack, and has been an Apple partner ever since. And consequently, we've been an Apple partner ever since, and we're part of the Apple Consultants Network. And that's been a real heavy strain of our evolutionary branch. I'm not sure if branch is it, because it's really the trunk of the tree, I guess. But it's been a strong component of Point ever since it was founded.
So very Apple focused.
Sort of. I say that, but we're in New York, we're 50-50. On the West Coast, it's more like 60-40, surprisingly enough, because we have some architectural firms that are not on Macs, because they use tools that they don't feel as comfortable using on a Mac. So, and that has shifted, over the past 5 years. There have been a few architectural companies that have gone back and forth. Like, they were PCs throughout the 90s until the early teens, and then they switched over, and some of them have switched back, like over the past 5 years. And now they're looking again, at what's available. So that's pretty much the origin. And then from there, he grew to like 2 or 3 people rotating in, first as contractors and then as full-time employees within, I think, the first 5 years. And now the trajectory for us as an MSP has been a little bit different than what I experienced in the past. One of the past MSPs that I worked for, we started with 5 people, and we scaled up really fast, or relatively fast. Like we had headcount as a goal. Like, we want to get to 20, then we want to get to 30, and we were 65 people in 4 offices, and then we got sold. And the strategy for us is a little bit different with Point now. I joined Gene about 3 years ago. We met through Apple, because Apple corporate recommended that we meet each other, and we just hit it off. And he's like, hey, why don't you come work with me and do West Coast stuff, and I'll stay here in New York, and we'll kind of switch off. So but the trajectory now for MSPs, and especially with the time that we're in now, is going to be different. But one of the main differences that the stuff that I'm seeing with what we're doing, at the old firm that I was with, we were more like 20 to 25 people. And now we have a head count of just under 15. So, the maturity of the tools that are out there for us to use, the amount of automation that we use is different. And in fact, the beginning part of the last decade, automation was not really a part of an MSP toolkit. And now we're constantly looking for things like, okay, what part of the onboarding can we automate? Because we do things over and over, right? So anyway, that's a little bit of a long answer to both the origin and of where we are now, and probably a little bit of what you and I are thinking a lot about right now, which is where are we now and where do we go from here?
Yeah, and I certainly would want to focus some of this around, there's this other question in here about what does hospitality have to do with MSPs? Why don't we talk about that for a second?
Sure. Everyone remembers when they go to a good hotel. It's kind of funny talking about this now because all of the travel industry and hospitality, it's like the first thing that went. So when I think about it, I'm like, whoa, how do
Remember
I?
back in the day when we had hotels?
Yeah, or when you could have meals with people, right? But people still remember what their favorite restaurant experience was, or what their hotel, when they went on vacation and they had a great hotel experience. So that doesn't necessarily ring true of most people's experiences with MSPs and the kind of stuff that we do. And a lot of times it's because engineers are focused on whatever task is at hand. You ask me to do A, I do A. We don't talk about why you want to get to C, or we don't even a lot of times have in mind why you want to get to further down the line. Hospitality is not like that. When you serve someone, and in our business it's service delivery, so it's like making the call back or emailing back or finding out about a vendor. That's just regular service, and the same is true in the restaurant business. Someone bringing you a glass of water, someone clearing your plate, someone decanting wine for you, or making sure that all the orders get to the table at the same time. Those are all elements of service, different restaurants do them well to varying degrees, but it's a combination of all those things that create the overall impression and create the overall reason why we go back time and time again to our restaurant. And if you're a regular at a restaurant, or if you go to a regular vacation spot, they get to know you and they'll make recommendations about, hey, we have this kind of dish that's going to be available because these ingredients are coming on, into season. Would you like to try that? And the relation to hospitality is really because of one book, which I thought I had with me. In fact, I do. And it's this book.
Setting the Table.
Yep.
And the Transforming Power of Hospitality in Business. Oh, okay. I see. Who's the author?
The author is Danny Meyer. He founded the Union Square Group in New York. And this book is kind of at the center of a lot of stuff that we do. How we think about ourselves, how we think about our clients. Because Gene was reading this, and when I first started talking to him about joining him, he's like, look, I'm starting to get into this book, and it's the first business book that I've read that every page I turned, I was like, tell me more. So I'll encapsulate for you kind of some of the things that I've been saying, but this is from the book. It's understanding the distinction between service and hospitality has been at the foundation of our success. Service is the technical delivery of a product. Hospitality is how the delivery of that product makes its recipient feel. Service is a monologue. We decide how we want to do things and set our standards for service. Hospitality, on the other hand, is a dialogue. To be on a guest's side requires listening to that person with every sense and following up with a thoughtful, gracious, appropriate response. It takes both great service and great hospitality to rise to the top. So that guides what I've said in there. You know, engineers, like I said, have a lot of mindset of like, I'm performing this task for you. So when we're looking for engineers, or we're looking for people to work with, or we're looking for people to partner with, a lot of it goes back to that, you know, about having a dialogue with our customers. Like, what do you want to do this for? And I used to parallel it with a mechanic. It's very rare that you'll go to a car mechanic and be like, hey, change the injection for me. I've heard about, you know, a part that'll make my car better. Most of the time, because people don't know about fuel injection anyway, so they're not going to come up with something like that. But, you know, it's like going into a restaurant and saying, hey, I only like hamburger. I like this kind of hamburger. It's not on your menu. Will you cook it for me? And the whole reason you're going to the restaurant is because, you know, you've tasted what they do. They've put together a superlative, whatever kind of dish, and you're like, hey, I really like what they do. And that allows you kind of in the future to be, you know, that restaurant comes to you and says, we're trying this out. Would you like to, you know, try that? Would it be to your taste? So anyway, I hope that helps a little bit in bridging the understanding of how we approach, how we do business, and how we think of ourselves more as a hospitality business than a technology provider. Because all of us do that. All MSPs are technology providers in some way, shape, or form, you know. But
well, you have MSPs that deliver a service, but I do like the spin that your company has taken on adopting hospitality as the next level of that, because it's true in our industry in IT, there is a lot of technical jargon, technical skill without those soft skills, without the people skills, the interpersonal skills, the proactive levels of communication that we all really enjoy receiving in service-based industries where you really have excellent examples and leaders in that. And so it's rewarding for me, you know, side note here, not to derail the conversation too much, but the boot camp that my company does for other IT people is to address that specific pitfall in a lot of our industry's lack of interpersonal skills and communication skills. And it sounds like your company Point has actually identified that as a crucial aspect of what it really means to provide excellent managed services. And the natural extension, I would imagine, is that your client churn is relatively low. When you're setting the bar really high for the expected levels of service, and then somebody wants to actually go shopping around and then realize that that bar is quite a bit lower in a lot of other places because there's not as much focus on that. It gets really easy to keep on clients that otherwise would have started going around because they might have been dissatisfied otherwise. So you're keeping them happy, and that's the key.
Well, not only is client churn low, but our engineer churn is low because it's very clear to them why they're doing what they're doing, or why we should be, you know, most engineers that start out in this business, they really, sometimes they don't express it well, but at the root of why they do what they do, even if they can't identify it, is because they enjoy helping people. Sometimes the behaviors surrounding that are not the best. You know, you'll always hear about people that have met gruff engineers that are like, yeah, the guy just came over and, you know, did this. Everyone thinks of like Nick, the IT guy from SNL, as an example, right? But not only is our customer churn low, but I think more importantly, our engineering churn has been low. Now, that was more of a point, I think, before we hit March of this year, right?
Right.
But I like, for me, it was more of a selling point for a point, because I'd be like, yeah, we've got guys that on average have been there at least 2.5 to 3 years, which is unusual for MSPs because people get burned out. A lot of times they're thrown into not just one, but multiple fires across a client base. They don't have any documentation. They have no idea what the goal of their service delivery is supposed to be. They don't know what their standard of service is supposed to be to the whole client base. So, you'll get engineers that are just frustrated and get burned out. And a lot of and that's the cause a lot of times for the crappy service delivery that people get and what they associate with MSPs is because they haven't standardized and they don't have really an overarching message like, hey, I'm here to help you. And that's why I do what I do.
It's an interesting observation. Most MSPs have standardization on their minds, but to your point, standardization is usually focused on how do you standardize the client setup, the computers that they use, the software that they deploy for clients. They try to standardize certain things, but don't necessarily look at internal standardization for their staff of process and how do you do phone calls and how do you process and do onboarding and how do you ensure the same standard of delivery no matter what client you're working with, no matter what their stack is, right? So it's interesting you guys have extended the idea of standardization further than what is typical for a lot of MSPs. And there's some established MSPs certainly that have survived and thrived as long as they have because they have learned how to standardize. But even then, everybody's unique and has a different focus that they wrap that around. And so that's really helpful. I do want to focus a little bit in, I have a little bit more of a pointed question around future tense. You had commented on, this was up until March, and then we all kind of know what happened in March. So here we are 2 months in, and this third question here, what do you see in the future of our industry? I think is also a topical question when we talk about social distancing and what's considered essential, and the fact that we have technologically been able to perform a lot of work remotely. And while for efficiency's sake we move towards that, I don't think we've ever really faced a industry-wide kind of challenge against almost the necessity of avoiding on-site, if at all possible. So I'm curious what your thoughts on that.
I'll rewind to some of our earliest response a little bit. On both coasts, before March 11th, we started, at the end of February, we started messaging our clients and saying, we don't exactly know what the future looks like on either coast. And certainly since we're centered in New York, it was a judgment call on our part to start descheduling or canceling for the foreseeable future all future on-sites. And that started happening at the end of February for us. And it was pretty easy to roll out because the way that we approached on-sites is that it's more of a nice to have. And because if we're doing our job right, you shouldn't need the person on site, except for in the extreme case when you need something, when you need hands on that stuff. So if we're doing our job right, we actually have been, pushing towards being more away from on-sites. So what does the future look like? I think the future looks more like a remote world than any of us could have ever imagined. I don't know if companies will return to, having a central office anymore. That's a lot of what's being talked about on both coasts. I mean, New York is the densest city in America, and San Francisco is number 2. In terms of population, New York is number 1, but San Francisco is number 13. which means that already in the Bay Area, there are differences because, people largely have been able to figure out how to work from home in a different way. So it's going to look a little different on both coasts, but the future is definitely remote.
And I can speak a little bit to at least Bay Area news that I've been keeping up with on this. You commented on, we're going to go a lot more remote. And when we talk about things like the tech bubble here in San Francisco and the Bay Area, I look to companies like Google, Slack, Twitter,
Twitter, yeah.
as examples of their news about either extending their date through next year for when they expect to go back to work in the office as a regular basic, course. But there's a couple of them, and I believe it was Twitter was certainly one of them, and Slack as well, where they just took away the time limit. They just said, if you want to continue to work from home for the rest of your employment here and you're capable of doing it, we want to give you that option in perpetuity. Go ahead, knock yourself out. And so they're already taking steps. And I look at them as a certain kind of leader in this space because they are giant, right? They are international companies by platform, by their nature, but they can set the tone. And I am certainly picking up on exactly that kind of tone where no office anywhere is necessarily going to simply disappear. But I very much see things like staggered schedules, reduced office space because of staggered schedules and partial telecommuting, and part of the staff being permanently telecommuting and so on. That you can have a company that would have 500 people that would show up in the same office every day, Monday through Friday, suddenly turning into at any given point maybe there's 100 or 200 because there's staggered shifts, there's telecommuting, and all of that kind of stuff. So. No, it's really interesting. Well, that's it for the main questions. I do want to go into a little bit more on Point specifically. So first question along those lines is, it's a multi-part question, but what demographics, pain points, desires do your ideal clients have?
That's a good question, and I was thinking, I'm always thinking about this, right? But I've been thinking about how it's changed during what we're going on. And I actually want to throw it back to you because something unique about, the reason that you and I are talking is because, or that we began talking is because we serve clients that look a little bit different, right?
Right.
So your ideal client size is 5 and under, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So, yeah, and we can go ahead and do that as actually a play back and forth. So why don't we look at these parts in sequence? So demographics, right? Mine would be individuals, solopreneurs, freelancers. And by the way, individuals I consider just home users. They could be working at a large company somewhere and they have a personal computer, is what I mean by that. And small businesses, typically in professional services like law firms or financial wealth management and that kind of stuff, of 2 to 5 people. And so I have kind of 4 buckets, so to speak, that I service. But you're right, they're all in that 1 to 5 people.
Solopreneur,
Freelance.
people at larger companies that want home support.
Yes.
And give me the other 2 because I'm not.
I separate solopreneur from freelancer, but
Okay.
they feel the same to a lot of people. But one really operates primarily a business, and the second one is more along the lines of maybe they have 1 or 2 really, really large clients and they're effectively 1099s in a lot of cases for other places. So I kind of distinguish freelancer, self-employed versus solopreneur, where they're really trying to craft their own practice and have at least a few different clients that are all equally weighted. So there's different considerations for those. And then, yes, the fourth one would be 2 to 5 people in a small business.
Right.
Something that's evolved a little bit past solopreneur, but still is extremely stable where it is. If you have a law practice of 2 or 3 attorneys, and they're not going to turn into 15 anytime soon, right? Those are that's the demographic that I focus in on. And what about you, demographic wise?
Well, we're kind of the it, we're kind of the people that when you get to being about 10 people, people are like, we can't manage, or we don't want our people to be managing the Wi-Fi. We don't want them to be um, managing deploying out tools. We don't want them necessarily to be involved in figuring out what our next tool is going to be, SaaS tool or whatever. We don't want them thinking about how to structure backup or, structure, our cloud strategy. Like, we don't want that to necessarily be on our internal engineers. So it's a lot of people that just start to get to the point where they can't manage the computers themselves, or they've when the kind of service that you guys are, you can have that one-to-one, but what happens with a lot of people that serve the market that you do is they're just like, I don't want to deal with that whole kind of mess, right? So we're actually our client's profile in a funny sense is your dumping ground. You're like, I don't want to I don't want to get to that level of complexity, or not complexity, but I don't know of a more
Scale complexity actually would probably be a
is
good
it
term
okay,
that I would use on my side. And it's interesting, it works in both directions,
right,
because I think, as you were inferencing, is that a lot of your engineers with a personal computer talking about something with their Sonos or something having to do with their Outlook, and it's a one-time situation most of the time, and then it's going to be 6 months, and then you're going to hear from them again with something else random. There's no standardization around that. And how do you standardize around a software stack or hardware stack for a person that is very cowboy like in how they run their freelancing, or their solopreneur, or even their small business? Small business in 2 to 5 might get around to the idea where you can really start convincing them around the merits of standardization. But again, if they're two, you're less likely to have any kind of sense of standardization, versus if they're up at the 5 range, they can be convinced of it. And
well,
so, yeah.
that actually brings us to the next part of the client profile, because aside from standardization, or the opposite, or not opposite, but it's a little bit opposed to it, is specialization. So for example, if your company starts to get to a place where there are different job functions, there's a sales person type, there's a marketing person type, there are developer types and different
Delegation
types of code,
slash division of labor.
right? That's where we kind of come in, because having an office manager configure computers for each type of job function, that is murderous for them. Like, you don't want and your company, you don't want your office manager doing that, nor do you want each specialized job function specializing for themselves. And meanwhile, what you're left with is no level of control, security, insight into what's going on, all that kind of stuff. An interesting thing that Gene and I talk about that came up in conversation yesterday was, before our whole coronavirus world started, a lot of people looked at security between home and office as being two separate things. But the way that our business worked is those were pretty much the same thing, because you take your laptop from work to home, it still has to have some kind of security and some kind of standardization to enable them to work from home. I will throw out one interesting thing that I learned from one of our sysadmins, is that this is an interesting just data point, that within 1 week of things shutting down on both coasts, the week of March 11th, where March 11th was the Wednesday, within 1 week of that and the mass shutdowns from both coasts, we had 90% of our client base on both coasts working from home. The other 10% are places that cannot necessarily work from home. We serve art galleries. This goes to like who our clients are. We serve art galleries in New York. And that's like, you have to go to the place to look at the stuff on the walls and put a little red dot on it. Although we're also a partner with a virtual tool that we've helped galleries use and transition more towards. They already were starting to work remotely.
Kind of similar to like the idea of streaming at the zoo kind of thing, where you can't have people coming to the zoo to look at the animals, but they were setting up video cameras and doing live streams so you can still experience it to a certain
extent. So there are a number of tools out there. There are a few competing tools that art galleries use to have a virtual gallery, and we had already set those people up, but it took a little bit longer because they were not set up they were set up for being centralized and having a virtual gallery for everybody else, but they weren't set up for having all their workers here and then also on top of that having a virtual gallery. So yeah, it was really interesting because I talked to our sysadmin. I was like, you mean within a week we had everybody up and running? He's like, yeah, because we had set things up so that having a VPN was not a problem, and part of that was our technology stack. People that do not have very good Wi-Fi in the office and have certain protocols are going to have problems like, well, only one person could VPN into our office and use the server at a time. And we were able to enable that, right away. So that's another element of what a good client for us is going to look like in the future. It's multiple people with different needs and different levels of access that are needed, and someone to keep track of that, right? And that's some of what we do.
Where it gets really complicated for them to try and keep it
right. They're straight. Like, I want all my salespeople to have access to this, but I don't want them to have access to my company's, accounting. I want all of my accounting people and my controller and all this stuff to have access to, all of AP and AR, but they don't need access to sales materials. So
let me focus on one other part of this question, which I want to see if we can tie this back. Now, when we were talking earlier about Point and its adaptation of this hospitality principle, do you find that a lot of your clients come to you with a specific pain point around that lack of hospitality from another IT provider?
It hasn't. Most often it's discovered that that's a pain point after talking to them, but it's not usually the initial thing. And I think it's because people are so used to having a certain type of MSP, or they're in a lot of, I guess I'll just say it, most people are used to bad service or bad attitudes from MSPs. It's the norm rather than the exception.
This is a fantastic observation, actually. So I find a very similar kind of thought when it comes to pain points, right? And since we were kind of doing this as a back and forth, right, the pain point that you're discovering after some of the conversation has happened is that there's that night and day difference that starts to appear once you start working with them and they start realizing that you're on this other level of service, this hospitality element, and they go, wow, I'm just so, they've been, what would be almost a sense of brainwashing, not brainwashing, but, it's you've been conditioned. There we go. There's this conditioning that happens where, because it is so common, that there is this discrepancy between the technical skills and the interpersonal skills from most IT people, and that a lot of IT people will be at MSPs that don't have that level, or that at least that standardization of high level of hospitality style service, that there's not the expectation. So it's not a conscious initial point of conversation that you see,
Yeah.
that you see it after the fact. For us, it's a very similar concept around remembering that my demographic is 1 to 5 people, and a very common range for most MSPs to try and avoid, because of what we were talking about earlier about that, who wants to try and figure out somebody's Sonos randomly for that one time a year that it's going to come up, right?
Right.
And so a lot of that conditioning that happens for people that are in 1 to 5 is a barrier that I find myself facing. And then they start to relax when they realize that there is this business model that provides these kinds of managed services and products, right? And that feeds into that core mission by me speaking more and more to that in all of my messaging and getting really consistent upon it. I start to give that permission for people to realize that it's not just that no IT company ever wants to talk to me because I've got 2 people, and it turns into, wow, I do actually have some opportunity and options. So it's the same thing. They don't come to me right away going, I can never get an IT person because nobody wants to talk to me. They don't come to me that way. They come to me with an explicit problem.
Right.
And then they realize that I actually have my entire business oriented around how to help them, their case, rather than them feeling like they're coming in as the exception to the rule, where they keep coming into it expecting me to have a 20-person client. And then I go, I don't. 80% of my clients are 1 person, 2 people kind of thing. And then they are always surprised by it. So I wanted to comment, and it was really amusing and to me to realize that we share a very similar form of mental conditioning from our respective clients, our ideal clients that come to us, because there is that unfortunate standard, that unfortunate default that has been drilled into them repeatedly.
Well, it's all of their past experience.
Exactly. And it's interesting because the past does inform the future to a certain extent, but also we were talking earlier about how automation is feeding a lot of the future and how it gets easier and easier to onboard. It would be interesting to see if future MSPs would start to find themselves dabbling more often in my business's space, because of that level of automation makes it possible. It's a fascinating idea that I think of every once in a while, but we certainly can go into the weeds, but I do want to be a little conscious of our time. I have 3 more main questions here, so let me go through them really quick. Next question is, what would make an ideal referral partner for you?
What is, does that mean like someone that, because the way that I initially think about that is when you say who's an ideal referral partner for us, I think of that as an ideal client. Is that what you mean? Or
more a source of clients?
Oh, okay. I have to think about that just a little bit, because in our language, when Gene and I talk to people, we're like, hey, we're looking before we sign a client. A lot of times we in our email and in our communications, where we usually say we're looking forward to partnering with you. So that's drilled into my head, so I have to think about, okay, it's
good terminology to have as a side note, for sure, because it really evokes that sense of, it's not just us providing you a service in a client vendor interaction, right?
Well,
what your desires are, what your long-term goals are. If we help you with them, we all are collectively happier than if we just try and treat this as a transaction. So yeah. I do like that word choice.
It goes back to the quote that I was giving you from Danny Myers, though, that it's a dialogue, and you have to have a partner relationship.
Yeah. Talk with them, not to them or at them.
Right. Yeah. And vice versa. People come to us and they're like, I've heard of this. For example, I've heard about AWS Google Cloud something, and Microsoft has something. I think it's called Azure, and we want to go with Amazon. It's like, why? And a lot of times, they've done all this pre-thinking, or they've already latched onto something, because there's been such pain in the past of asking anybody's opinion, their own IT people or the IT people they use. There's been so much pain involved in asking for an opinion on that. And instead of getting a response back as to, well, what do you need it for? I mean, this service may be overkill. Yeah. Do you need to stay on-prem, or do you need to go to cloud, or do you need a hybrid or on-prem solution? Mm-hmm. A lot of times people don't even think that they can come to a place like us and have a partnering type of conversation or discussion.
One of the principles in our boot camp with for these IT people, one of these core principles is kind of what you're talking about, is the idea that to be solution and goal focused, not focus on the request. Because what you're describing here is an example of somebody that comes to you with a request, and more often than not, we'll take it at face value as tech people and just be like, you want this? Sure, let's figure out what it takes to put this in place. And you're feeding into the explicit request, and while it might be appropriate, they have a goal, which is what you're talking about. What are you trying to actually achieve by putting something like this in? Because when you dig underneath that and you realize what the end goal is, that request rabbit hole might not have anything to do with where they want to end up, because at the end of the day, they are not IT, but you are, and you kind of know usually better what options can best suit a certain goal. And if they come to you with too much of that detail, I certainly treat it as a yellow flag myself. And I teach everybody that works with me the same thing. Is like, it's fine if you want to do your own research, but I'm always going to be that second opinion by nature, because I want to double check what your goals are, right, to make sure that we're not making a critical mistake.
Let's take the. I don't want to diverge too far.
I do feel like we did get off topic, didn't we?
But
let's finish the thought.
So let's go. I have some thoughts about that, but we can actually probably have another discussion just centered around that.
Sure. We've dabbled a little bit in a few topics that could easily fall into another interview. So it'd be interesting to have you back for some of those topics for sure. So, okay, let's circle back to the original question here, which was ideal referral partner. So somebody, and since we were doing this as a back and forth in the first set of questions about the demographics and pain points, I'll go first so you can get an example.
Great, thanks.
An ideal referral partner for me, for BH Tech Connection, is MSPs, the traditional style, right? And I call it the traditional style because that traditional style involving the size of the client that is ideal, right? So your point is 10 or more people, right? And there's other MSPs that I interact with every once in a while that maybe be 25 plus, or they'll say, hey, we'll work with as few as 10, but our sweet spot is 50 to 100. It changes based on, obviously, the company, their specialization. Some of them are Apple focused, some are Windows focused, some focus on cloud integration, whatever, right? But the ideal referral partner for me is that it gives them a way to send people that are not ideal for them. They're outside of their ideal range. That's usually because it's too small, realistically speaking.
Right.
And it gives them a way to not say no. And on the chance that that client is growth minded, that potential client that maybe they're 5 people have plans for, within the next year or 2, they're going to start hiring because they're hoping to get X, Y, and Z knocked out of the way, and then they're going to end up being 10, 20. It sets up a really good reflection that way. And even without those cases, it still gives them the goodwill of saying, hey, I'm not going to just say no and leave you out in the cold. We want to have that good reputation. I've even seen with myself, when I've done that actual act of referring out, I've literally gotten a 5-star review before on my Yelp for not a client. It was somebody that approached me that was not in my specialty, and I jumped on a phone with them for 5 or 10 minutes, ended up referring them somewhere else, and that's how I got a 5-star review, because they were so impressed by that level of handholding to get the solution for them. It wasn't going to be my company, but they got to the solution. And so that kind of desire to be able to not only help the community around you, but have it come back and reflect in unexpected ways, or unpredictable potentially ways, right? You don't know how it's going to come back, but you trust that it does. And so those make the best ideal referral partners for me as a source. Whether it's reflective, if it's back and forth, that's even better. In my case, not so much. Usually it's more one-sided in those cases, because it's usually there, for my company, there's at least 50 other MSPs that work in a larger range. So when it's extremely rare, I would get a potential client that's 15 people, because they see my messaging all over the website talking about how I'm working with solopreneurs and freelancers, and anybody reading that is going to be like, well, I guess that's not really going to be an ideal client for this guy. Okay. Right. Yeah. So anyway,
the formation of your funnel to what an ideal client for you looks like is something that I really admire in you, because it's very clear for both you and for them, like, you're my kind of person that I need to be dealing with. And that's, that goes both ways. So ideal referral partner would be for us. And this is something that I've been thinking about for a little bit, in the way that you've described it now. I think an ideal referral partner would probably be startup accelerators, because over the past 3 to 5 years, things have changed. They actually said they advised their companies to go in-house with IT, because of something I said earlier, which is there's a lot of churn within MSPs. I'm sure you know a lot of people that have been at one MSP, and then they just, within a year and a half usually, they get burned out, and they're like, I have nowhere else to go. Like, I can get up this high as an engineer, but I have nothing new to work on, and the pace and chaos are too much for me. So VC firms and startups accelerators have not, in the past few years, been good recommenders or good partners to recommend services like us. But I think they are who would be ideal partners, because they can go to their, seed companies and say, you guys should not be wasting your time on this. And we don't want your operating runway to be taken up by using $250,000 to hire 3 people to do all these functions.
Well, an interesting thing that I feel like you're circling around, and I want to kind of just hit that right on the head, is historically they have seen the industry of MSP, of IT managed services, as being a high churn situation. They have dissuaded against outsourcing and rather do internal, because you can keep the person longer and have more consistency. And I can see where they come across with that, right? In theory, all across the board. And the flip side of that is that we're not talking about them referring to just an MSP. We're talking about, in this case, an ideal referral partner of working with Point. And that is a completely different question, because Point has this hospitality focused thing and has statistical evidence to point to of your average, tenure of your internal techs and engineers. And that would be a completely different conversation from looking at the average industry standards. So it's really interesting to hear you say that, because they may not come and approach you, but certainly anybody that might be watching this video at some point that is part of a VC firm or startup accelerator or works with them frequently would be interesting to make that connection with you. And I do have one other question, but I think I'm going to put that at the end. So the next question that feels like an appropriate segue to that is, what's the best way for our subscribers and viewers of this video to get in touch with you?
Right now it's through email. I guess hold on. Let me amend that. That's the easiest way. I think the best way is really with a phone call. I find that over the past 2 months, I've really gotten tired of video conferencing. And a lot of it is because I don't feel like I'm a good enough performer anymore. Like also, this whole time I've had to look up at what would be an eye line contact with you, but in actuality is not. So I'll have to every once in a while shift my eyes down to the main screen so I can see your reactions and things. And I realize that it's when I talk to people, they're also having to perform. So a video conference call, I don't really recommend as another. I think the easiest way is email, but I think the best way is with a phone call.
Avoid muddying the water with that kind of almost eye avoidance by accident kind of thing you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things that I learned about Terry Gross and Fresh Air is that she's oftentimes not in the room with her subjects. Do you listen to Fresh Air at all?
I don't, but I have heard of the podcast.
She gets incredibly personal and revealing interviews because she's usually in a dark box in her studio in Philadelphia. And a lot of times the interviewee is also remote, but it's all done through voice. And I think that there's something incredibly valuable now that we're rediscovering just with voice phone calls. Because it allows us to be active listeners. And it goes back to some of what I said about, hospitality. It's an interesting thing. Like, that is your only sense that you're using. So you're hearing visual cues like, the person is smiling on the other end, or, you get this out of inflection. But there's a reason that the telephone call is starting to see a resurgence, and why it's lasted so long. It's gone down because people have used video conferencing right now. But I think the best way moving forward is if people want to reach out, to email me and schedule just a conversation. Usually 15 minutes will determine whether or not there's another 15 minutes that's worthwhile.
And what I can do is I can put any number of things in the description for this video, and if you wanted to share them publicly, verbally, this would be a good opportunity as well. If the best way would be by phone, and you'd like to schedule that, is there an easy place that you can either verbally share or otherwise provide to me, and I can include in the description for them to actually make that contact with you specifically?
I think what I'll do is make sure that I give you a link so that all they have to do is press a button to schedule. Because our phone numbers are readily available on either coast. But I don't know about you, whenever someone has left a phone number like call blah, 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 or, go to this number, I just end up I'll spend the next 3 minutes trying to find a pen and then something to write on, because I don't write anything down,
That's certainly fair. And this will end up on YouTube for sure. And so I'll make sure that the description includes that link that you'll provide me so that somebody can go ahead and follow that to schedule a call with you. And that way we don't have to worry about verbal mismatch of phone numbers or of getting the URL wrong because it was spoken out loud in a video. So I'll go ahead and collect that from you and make sure it's in the description. Excellent. And now the last question that I have for you is, we've covered a lot of information here, right? We've been talking for a little bit more than an hour, I think. What would be the one thing you'd want someone to take away from today's interview?
One thing. I guess it's really the central message. that the central message really is that we're in a people business, and it's easy to forget that. We are in the hospitality business because we are in a people business. Ultimately, it's going to be easier and easier to deliver things and automate things, but like any number of the tools that we have. But I think I would like people to remember that our business is a hospitality business. I'm much more interested in people coming to us and asking, what do you think of A versus B? Because we have this business goal. And it's the reason why human beings, that's what business is. If you go to a lawyer, you're asking for that lawyer's legal opinion about how to approach something. If you go to a good car mechanic, and I'm not talking about a parts changer, people can always, move tires around, whatever. That's easy enough to do. But the reason you go to your restaurant is because someone over time has learned what you like. I don't know if you've ever been a regular at a restaurant, or if what I learned from my parents is that become a regular at a restaurant and you'll find that you get free meals, which is something I didn't,
Sometimes free desserts was more common for me, but yeah.
Right. And what'll happen is that they'll like, hey, I'm not even going to offer you. That's a great example. Like, I'm not even going to offer you pecan pie because I know that you'd never eat it. So here's a bunch of chocolate because I know you love chocolate. And that only happens because that restaurant knows you. The wait staff knows you. Maybe the wait staff and the owner knows you, right? But that's what the hospitality business is, and that's what our business is that, we need to get to know, we're looking for the long-term relationship with our clients so that we're able to make recommendations like, hey, this period that you're in is going to change your business in a fundamentally different way. Here's what we think you should do. Maybe think about it, So it's everything from like how contracts are produced. People sometimes are still using paper. So we're able, if we're in a long-term relationship with a business, we're like, hey, you push a lot of paper. Do you want to keep doing that? Or, we have across our client base, they're using this. Would you like to, it's like, that's your dessert, right? Yeah. Or that's your main course that you didn't know that you were going to like, that becomes completely essential to you. So yeah, hospitality is the business
industry. We're in a people industry.
Yeah, we're in a people industry. And actually, and that's why the book was so relevant to Gene, is because all successful businesses, whatever tranche that they're in, like an accountant, you don't go to an accountant necessarily because you need numbers just primarily crunched, but you go to a financial advisor or a planner because they're like, hey, you want to retire along this timeline, or you want to have this ability to travel. I'm going to help you get there. Not just by adding up and like having your IRS forms and knowing what all those numbers are, but I know what you want to achieve in life. And that's only possible because you're asking each other, what do you think of, can you help me get to how can I make my business more reactive to? Those are people conversations. They're not tool conversations. They're not hardware conversations. Those are only the means by which you get someplace. And that is the larger definition of technology. It's the level, technology is really just the level of tool use. All those things that your business uses, that our business uses, those are just tools. So it's our job to be like, that hammer is not going to work. You really need a sledgehammer here. And here's why. So yeah, that's the one thing.
Cool. Well, that's it for today's video. Thanks, Jeff. This was a fairly decent sized interview, I'd say. So I appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Brady. Thanks for the offer too.
Yeah, of course. And I'd love to have you back on future topics for sure. And to the watchers, don't forget to like and share this video, particularly if there's anything in here that resonates with you and think would be really important for somebody else to watch. And in the meantime, thank you very much. I'm Brady Helkenn with BH Tech Connection, and I had Jeff Young with Point here as my guest, and I'll see you again next time.